If you go now, my dad is gonna think I really want.
But wasn't that exactly what you tried to do for 6 days?
Yeah, but then I realized that winning would be the biggest loss of my life.
Zayd Al-Marwan was suffocating. It wasn't a lack of air. Oxygen flowed in and out of his lungs with perfect regularity as he stood before the panoramic window of his private office, gazing out at the desert stretching as far as the eye could see. It wasn't claustrophobia either. The palace boasted over 300,000 square feet of white marble and gold, with corridors wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast and halls so immense that a voice would echo for full seconds before dying into silence. It was something worse. Much worse. It was the visceral, inescapable feeling that his entire life had been choreographed by others from the moment he left his mother's womb. Every breath supervised, every movement analyzed, every decision made by hands that were not his own. 32 years of existence where he had never, not once, had a real choice in anything that truly mattered. And now, the final prison. An arranged marriage. Zayd gritted his teeth until his jaw physically ached, the muscles bunching beneath the perfectly trimmed beard that covered skin bronzed by the relentless desert sun. His hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles turned white, veins popping along muscular forearms exposed by the sleeves of his white linen shirt, rolled up to the elbows. He was a large man, 6'3" of pure masculinity, built through years of brutal military training that began at age 6. But in that moment, he felt as small as a helpless child awaiting inevitable punishment. 7 days. The Sultan, his father, a man Zayd loved and feared an equal. Devastating measure, had set the ceremony for 7 days from now. 1 week, 168 hours before Zayd became the husband of a woman he had never met in person. A woman whose name he could barely pronounce without feeling anger burn like corrosive acid in his veins. A woman whose face he only knew from an old, formal photograph showing a princess with a blank expression and eyes that revealed absolutely nothing about the person behind the mask carefully constructed by royal expectation. Amira al-Zahra. Even the name sounded like a gilded cage he hadn't asked for. Zayd closed his honey-colored eyes, unusual for a man of the desert, a heritage from his Persian grandmother. The color of warm, liquid amber contrasting sharply with his tanned skin and hair as black as a moonless night, and tried to breathe through the fury threatening to explode from his chest in a primal scream of rebellion that would shake the ancient palace walls to their foundations buried in the sand. He had a plan. The words echoed in his mind with the weight of a promise and a threat, inextricably intertwined. He had a plan that would change everything, that would turn this impossible situation in his favor, giving him back the control others had stolen from him over 3 full decades of living on everyone's terms but his own. A cruel plan. A plan that would require him to transform into a version of himself he wasn't sure he could sustain for 7 full days without hating himself afterward. But what choice did he have? None. That was the answer. Bitter as bile on his tongue. No real choice. Only the illusion of free will that vanished the moment he tried to actually exercise it. According to an ancient royal tradition dating back centuries, an unwritten but absolutely unbreakable law among the families who had ruled these lands since before time was measured by Western calendars, the bride and groom must spend a week living together before the official ceremony. 7 days residing in the isolated summer palace deep in the desert, far from prying eyes and gossiping tongues, to properly get to know one another and ensure the couple was compatible enough to survive decades of an arranged marriage without causing a public scandal or a diplomatic crisis. The idea, supposedly, was to create intimacy. But Zayd was going to use this tradition against itself. The plan was simple in theory, yet brutally difficult in execution. He would be so unbearable, so impossible, so absolutely disrespectful and cruel during those 7 full days that Princess Amira would call off the wedding with her dignity intact, claiming irreparable incompatibility between temperaments too opposite to share a life. That way, he would gain his freedom without openly disrespecting his dying father, because yes, the Sultan was ill, his body failing in ways the doctors tried to hide, but which Zayd saw clearly every time he looked at the man who was once an invincible giant, and without causing a diplomatic war between emirates that maintained a fragile peace through blood alliances and strategic marriages. The bride canceling was acceptable in tradition. Embarrassing perhaps, but acceptable. The groom canceling? An unforgivable insult that could spark an armed conflict. So, Zayd would make her give up on him. He would make her run back to the Al-Zahra Emirate and never want to see him again. 7 days of calculated cruelty. 7 days of being a monster. 7 days of enduring being the worst version of himself. And then, he would be free. The office door opened without warning. Only one person in the entire palace had permission to enter without knocking, and Zayd didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He recognized the heavy footsteps of the chief advisor, a man who had served the Al-Marwan family for 40 years, and who had known Zayd since he was born, wrapped in white silk and bathed in water scented with desert rose petals. "She arrives at noon," Khalim said without preamble, his deep voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "The preparations are complete. The summer palace has been cleaned and stocked for 2 weeks, should you decide to extend the stay." Zayd finally turned, his amber eyes meeting the black eyes of the advisor, who was more of a father to him in some ways than the distant and authoritarian sultan had ever managed to be. "There will be no extension. 7 days will be more than enough." Something flickered across Khalim's wrinkled face. Concern perhaps, or sadness, or both mixed with the resignation of someone who had seen this story repeat itself generation after generation in royal families trapped in the same suffocating traditions. "Does your highness truly intend to go through with this plan?" It wasn't a real question. It was a warning disguised as a polite inquiry. Zayd crossed his powerful arms over his broad chest, his defensive posture revealing more than he intended about the insecurity gnawing at his stomach like a starving rat. "Do you have a better alternative? Some magical way for me to cancel without causing an international crisis? Without disrespecting my dying father who wants to see his son married before passing on the crown?" Khalim sighed, the heavy sound of 1,000 similar conversations over the years. "You could try to get to know the girl before deciding to destroy her emotionally." The word girl triggered a strange reaction in Zayd's chest. He had seen the photograph. Amira was 27, not a child, but a fully formed woman. Yet the word made something uncomfortable twist beneath his ribs. Something dangerously similar to guilt. He pushed the feeling down with brutal force. "She will survive," Zayd said with a coldness he didn't entirely feel. "Royal women are trained from childhood to endure bad marriages. Being rejected before the ceremony is far better than spending decades trapped in a loveless union." "Is that what your highness tells himself to sleep at night?" Khalim asked with the courage that came from 4 decades of loyal service. "That you are doing her a favor?" Zayd didn't answer because he didn't have a good answer. Khalim watched the prince for a long moment before shaking his head with a sadness that weighed on his stooped shoulders. The car bringing her departed the Al-Zahra Emirate at 5 in the morning. She should arrive at the summer palace at noon, as I said. "Does your highness intend to be there to receive her?" "No." The answer came fast and definitive. This would be the first deliberate insult. Protocol demanded the groom greet the bride personally upon arrival, guide her through the quarters she would occupy, and show at least the basic courtesy of welcoming the woman who had traveled hours across the desert to meet him. Zayd would make her wait, hours if necessary, until it became absolutely clear that he didn't care about her presence, had no interest in knowing her, and felt nothing but cold resentment for the entire situation. "I understand," Khalim said in a tone that made it clear he didn't approve but wouldn't try to change the decision. "Shall I inform the servants that your highness will be indisposed?" "Tell them whatever you want, I don't care." A lie. He cared. He cared too much. But admitting that was admitting weakness, and Zayd Al-Marwan could not afford to be weak. Not when he was about to do something so cruel. When Khalim left, closing the door behind him with a softness that somehow sounded like silent reproach, Zayd returned to the window and looked out at the desert stretching infinitely under the relentless midday sun. Somewhere out there, separated from him by miles of golden dunes and impossible blue sky, Amira Al-Zahra was traveling toward the destination that would change her life forever. She didn't know what awaited her. She didn't know that the man she had been promised to since childhood had a plan to destroy any chance they might have together. She didn't know that the next 7 days would be a test of emotional endurance that would challenge every ounce of strength she possessed. Zayd closed his honey eyes and tried to ignore the tightness in his chest that insisted on reminding him that perhaps, just perhaps, he was making a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. But it was too late to turn back. The plan was in motion, and Zayd Al-Marwan was not a man who gave up once a decision was made, even if it was a terrible decision. Amira al-Zahra had awakened before dawn. Not by choice. Her body had simply refused to remain asleep, her brain racing with thoughts spiraling in endless circles of anxiety and resignation, mixed in equal, devastating measure. She had lain in bed for hours, staring at the ornate ceiling of her room in the Al-Zahra palace, tracing the ancient paintings of desert flowers and impossible stars with her eyes, counting breaths and trying not to dwell on the fact that this was the last morning she would wake up in this bed, in this room, in this life. Today, everything changed. In a matter of hours, she would be at the summer palace in the middle of the desert, alone with a man she had never met, beginning a week of cohabitation that would determine the rest of her existence. The fear gripping her stomach was cold and heavy, like a stone at the bottom of a lightless well. But worse than the fear was the resignation, that tired, numb acceptance that there was no escape, no alternative, no real choice other than to do what was expected of her because that was what princesses did. They obeyed, they adapted, they survived. Amira was 27 years old and could not recall a single time in her life when she had made a significant decision about her own destiny. Every aspect of her existence had been planned, organized, and orchestrated by others since before she had real memories. What to eat, what to wear, what to study, how to speak, how to walk, how to sit, how to smile, how to breathe without causing scandal or shame to a family that carried centuries of tradition on backs bowed by the weight of expectation. When told at 15 that she would be married to Prince Zayd Al-Marwan when the appropriate time came, she had merely nodded with a polite smile practiced 1,000 times before the mirror. And now, 12 years later, the time had come. Amira rose from the bed with slow, careful movements, as if her entire body ached. And in a way, it did. Not physically, but emotionally. That dull, constant ache of living a life that wasn't truly hers. She walked to the window and pulled back the heavy emerald green velvet curtains, letting the faint light of dawn enter and paint the room in shades of pink and gold. The desert was waking up on the other side of the glass. Dunes stretched to the horizon in frozen waves of sand that changed color as the sun climbed. Dark amber turning to pale gold, then to a blinding white under the intensity of the light. It was beautiful in a way that hurt her chest. She was going to miss this view. She was going to miss a lot of things. The door opened behind her, and Amira didn't need to turn to know it was the maids coming to prepare her for the journey. They entered in respectful silence, carrying dresses and veils and boxes of jewelry she was required to wear, moving through the room with an efficiency born of years doing exactly this, preparing a princess for important events she had not chosen to attend. "Good morning, Your Highness," the eldest of the maids said. It was Layla, who had served the Al-Zahra family for 30 years and had known Amira since she was born, small, red, and screaming against the world. Her voice held a gentleness that sounded dangerously close to pity. Amira hated pity. She preferred anger or indifference or anything other than that look of sorrow she saw on everyone's faces lately. "Good morning, Layla," she replied, her voice coming out steadier than expected. "A small victory. Are we ready? Everything is prepared. The car will depart at 5 o'clock sharp. The journey to the summer palace will take approximately 7 hours across the desert. 7 hours. 7 hours to process, to prepare mentally, to build the emotional defenses she would need to survive what was coming. It wasn't enough time. A lifetime wouldn't be enough time. But it would have to do." The maids dressed her with reverent care, layers of pale blue silk that matched the honey-colored eyes she had inherited from her mother, a sheer veil covering black hair that fell in waves to her waist, sandals embroidered by hand with silver thread. They lined her eyes with dark kohl that made the honey color look even more intense and luminous, dabbed jasmine perfume on her wrists and neck, and fastened delicate bracelets that chimed softly when she moved her arms. Amira watched it all through the mirror, as if she were watching someone else being prepared for another destiny. Dissociation. It was the only way to survive. "You look beautiful, Your Highness," Layla said softly, her old, wise eyes meeting Amira's in the reflection. "Prince Zayd is a lucky man." Amira didn't answer because she didn't know what to say. Luck seemed like a strange word to describe an arranged marriage between strangers. When she finally descended the white marble stairs leading to the main courtyard where the car awaited, Amira saw her father for the last time before her departure. Sultan Al-Zahra stood near the vehicles, hands clasped behind his back, his expression neutral and distant as it had been her entire life. He had never been an affectionate man. He never hugged, never spoke soft words, never showed love in the way she had secretly craved as a small child, seeking validation that never came. But when his eyes met hers that morning, Amira saw something flicker briefly across his aged face before it was pushed down and hidden behind the royal mask. Regret, perhaps, or sadness, or both. "Amira," he said simply. "Just the name. Nothing more. Father." They stood there for a moment, suspended in time, the 10 feet between them feeling as impassable as the desert she was about to cross. Then the Sultan inclined his head by a millimeter, the maximum display of affection he was capable of, and turned, walking back into the palace without looking back. And Amira understood that this was goodbye. She entered the car with a heavy heart and breath controlled through years of training in maintaining composure. Even when everything inside her screamed to run, to flee, to refuse. But princesses didn't run. Princesses didn't flee. Princesses did what was expected of them. Always. The car began to move, leaving the Al-Zahra palace behind in a cloud of golden sand that shimmered under the rising sun. Amira looked out the window as the only home she had ever known disappeared on the horizon, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a tiny dot swallowed by the immensity of the desert. And for the first time since waking that morning, she let the tears fall. Silent, solitary, invisible to everyone but herself, crying for the end of one life and the beginning of another she hadn't chosen, but would have to live regardless. Day 1, Sunday. The summer palace appeared on the horizon exactly at noon, just as Kaleem had promised. An ancient, magnificent structure of white marble gleaming almost painfully under the relentless sun, surrounded by miles upon miles of golden dunes, stretching in every direction with no visible interruption. An isolated oasis of civilization in the middle of absolute nothingness. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The car pulled up to the main entrance where servants were already waiting in perfect formation. 6 men and 4 women dressed in immaculate traditional attire, all bowing respectfully as Amira stepped out of the vehicle on legs that trembled slightly after 7 hours of sitting. But he wasn't there. Zayd Al-Marwan was not there to receive her. The first blow came fast and surgical, like a sharp blade between the ribs. Amira felt something tighten in her chest, not surprise exactly, because part of her had already expected him not to be there. Yet it still hurt in a way it shouldn't have, considering she had never met him and therefore shouldn't care if he displayed an obvious lack of interest in her presence. But it mattered. Of course it mattered. Because even women resigned to arranged marriages harbored a fragile, pathetic hope deep in their hearts that perhaps, just perhaps, the man on the other side would have at least a basic curiosity about who she was. Apparently, Zayd Al-Marwan didn't even have that. One of the servants, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and eyes that avoided direct contact, as if she already knew exactly what was happening and felt pity, stepped forward and curtsied deeply. "Welcome, Your Highness. My name is Soraya, and I will be at your disposal during your stay. If you will permit me, I will guide you to your quarters." Her voice was polite, but there was thinly veiled embarrassment in her words. Everyone knew. Everyone realized the prince hadn't considered it important enough to be present. The insult was public and deliberate. Amira lifted her chin a fraction of an inch, a small gesture of defiance she had practiced since childhood whenever someone tried to make her feel small, and nodded with a grace born of years of training in maintaining dignity, even while being humiliated. "Thank you, Soraya. Please, lead the way." They entered the palace through gigantic carved wooden doors that opened into an impressive foyer, a ceiling soaring at least 30 feet high, decorated with intricate mosaics of blue and gold tiles, polished marble floors reflecting the natural light pouring in through enormous windows. The air scented with sandalwood incense burning in strategically placed bronze braziers. It was beautiful, cold too. Despite the suffocating heat of the desert outside, the interior of the palace felt almost unnaturally chilly, as if even the air there didn't want her presence. Soraya guided her down long, silent corridors, passing empty rooms and spaces that echoed with every step, until they reached a set of double dark wood doors at the end of a particularly isolated hallway. "These will be your quarters for the week, Your Highness," Soraya said as she opened the doors, revealing a generous and luxurious suite. A master bedroom with a massive bed covered in white silks, an ensuite bathroom with a marble tub, a spacious walk-in closet already partially filled with dresses and veils in various colors, and a sitting area with comfortable sofas and a panoramic view of the desert through windows that took up an entire wall. "His Highness Prince Zayd's quarters are in the opposite wing of the palace," Soraya continued without looking directly at Amira, as if the words were too embarrassing to speak while maintaining eye contact. "There is a bell there should you need anything. We will ring to announce meals." "Opposite wing. Of course, because God forbid they should have to share even the same corridor." Amira watched Soraya leave and close the door softly behind her, leaving her completely alone in a strange space that would be her home for the next 7 days. She walked to the window and looked out at the infinite desert, the dunes creating hypnotic patterns of light and shadow as the sun moved slowly across the ruthlessly blue sky. And she waited. She waited for hours, not knowing exactly what she was waiting for, but incapable of doing anything else. At 3 in the afternoon, she was still waiting, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap and posture perfect, trained to maintain it even when alone, because a lifetime of discipline didn't simply vanish just because there was no audience. At 5 in the afternoon, anger began to mix with resignation. At 7 in the evening, 5 full hours after her arrival, the bell finally rang, announcing dinner. And Amira knew with absolute devastating certainty that this was not forgetfulness or an accidental delay. It was a declaration of war. She rose slowly, smoothed the dress that had wrinkled from sitting for so long, checked her reflection in the mirror to ensure the mask of serenity was perfectly in place, and left her quarters with measured steps and her head held high. Dignity was all she had left. She wouldn't allow him to take that from her, too. The dining hall was in the center of the palace, a vast, elegant space with a long, dark wood table that could easily seat 20 people. But tonight had only 2 settings prepared, one at each end, maximizing the physical distance between the occupants. Zayd was already there. Amira saw him immediately upon entering, and the impact of finally seeing the man who would be her husband in person was like a punch that knocked the air from her lungs violently and unexpectedly. He was devastating. There was no other word. Zayd Al-Marwan sat at the head of the table with a relaxed posture that somehow managed to look dangerous and predatory all at once, his large, muscular frame filling the chair in a way that made it clear this was his territory, and she was an intruder, tolerated at best. He wore traditional white robes that contrasted sharply with his desert-bronzed skin, an immaculate thobe that covered his body, but failed to hide the broad shoulders and solid chest built through years of brutal physical training. But it was his face that truly stole her breath. A strong, defined jawline covered by a perfectly trimmed beard, a straight, aristocratic nose, full lips that, at that moment, were pressed into a hard, hostile line. Black hair swept back, revealing a high forehead and features that screamed ancient lineage and absolute power. And his eyes. God. His eyes. An impossible honey color. Liquid, warm amber glowing in the candlelight scattered around the room, so unusual and hypnotic that Amira felt something strange happen in her stomach when that gaze finally turned to her. There was no kindness there, no curiosity, nothing but calculated coldness and something darker she couldn't identify, but which made her heart beat faster in a way that wasn't entirely fear. They studied each other for a long, tense moment across the distance separating them. She standing at the entrance of the hall, he sitting at the table like a king on a throne receiving a subject he hadn't asked for. And Amira saw the exact second he deliberately looked away, as if the sight of her wasn't worth his continued attention. Another insult for the collection. She forced herself to walk to the other end of the table where her place was set, each step echoing in the heavy silence filling the space between them. She sat with practiced grace, placed the napkin on her lap with careful, measured movements, and waited. He said nothing. He offered no welcome. He didn't ask about the journey. He didn't acknowledge in any way that she existed there, in the same room, breathing the same air as him. The servants began bringing the food, course after course of traditional dishes that smelled wonderful, but which Amira knew she wouldn't be able to swallow past the knot tightening her throat. And yet, she served herself. And yet, she ate. Because giving up, showing weakness, would be giving him exactly what he wanted. The silence throughout the entire dinner was absolute and deafening. Zayd ate methodically, never lifting his eyes in her direction, as if he were completely alone. When she tried to initiate polite conversation, "The dunes are beautiful at sunset," he replied with a cold monosyllable that killed any attempt at dialogue before it could even begin. Yes. When she mentioned having studied the region's history, "I read that this palace was built 300 years ago by your family's ancestor," he didn't even look up from his plate. Hostile silence was the only answer she received. Amira ate slowly, maintaining her perfect posture even as everything inside her screamed to get up and run from that place, to go back home, to escape this cold man who looked at her as if she were an annoying insect he couldn't squash due to etiquette, but fervently wished would simply disappear. But she didn't run. She didn't cry. She showed no visible reaction to his deliberate cruelty. She just ate and drank water and kept her breathing controlled, counting the seconds between each inhale. When she finally finished, or pretended to finish, because most of the food was still on her plate, Amira wiped her lips with the napkin, placed it delicately beside her plate, and stood up with the intention of retiring to her quarters, where she could finally break down in private. And that was when Zayd spoke for the first time since she had entered the room. His voice was deep and rough in a way that sent something strange skittering down her spine. Not pleasure exactly, but definitely a physical reaction she couldn't control. "Don't get used to it." Amira froze mid-movement, hands still resting on the edge of the table, her entire body tense, waiting for the rest of the words she already knew would be cruel. He continued without looking at her, his honey eyes fixed on the wine glass swirling slowly between his long fingers. "This isn't a fairy tale. It is a political transaction, and I do not pretend to feel what I do not feel." The words cut like sharp blades through exposed flesh, leaving wounds that would bleed long after. But Amira al-Zahra was not a woman who crumbled publicly. She turned slowly to face him properly for the first time. And for the first time that entire night, she forced those honey eyes to meet hers directly. "I never expected a fairy tale, Your Highness," she said, her voice too controlled, a sign of emotion being contained with a force that physically hurt. "I know exactly what this is, and unlike you, I accept my duty without making it more difficult than it needs to be." She saw something flash in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she had answered back, that she hadn't simply lowered her head and accepted the cruelty in obedient silence as he likely expected. But the moment passed too quickly for her to be sure. Amira left the hall with her head held high and firm steps, hiding the tremor running through her legs, leaving Zayd alone with his thoughts and his deliberate cruelty. It was only when she reached her own quarters and locked the door behind her that she finally allowed the mask to slip. She slid down to the floor, back resting against the wood, hugged her knees to her chest, and cried. She cried for the humiliation of being treated as a nuisance. She cried for the marriage that was destroyed before it had even begun. She cried for the life she hadn't chosen but would have to live anyway. And when the tears finally dried, leaving salty tracks on her face, Amira stood up, washed her face with cold water, and looked at her own reflection in the mirror. Tomorrow would be another day. 6 more days of cohabitation ahead. 6 more days to survive. She could do this. She had to do this. Because giving up simply wasn't an option. Zayd remained seated in the dining hall for a long time after Amira left, the food turning to ash in his mouth, the wine souring in his stomach. He had done it. First night, and he had already made it absolutely clear he had no interest in her, that this marriage was an unwanted prison, that she should give up before she got hurt even more. He should be satisfied. He should be relieved. But all he felt was a strange emptiness in his chest and a bitter taste on his tongue that had nothing to do with the food. Her last words echoed in his mind in an unstoppable loop. Unlike you, I accept my duty without making it more difficult than it needs to be. The way she had said it, with ironclad dignity even when he could clearly see the pain hidden beneath the controlled surface, made something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. Guilt, perhaps. Or shame. Or both. Zayd pushed his chair back with unnecessary force and stood, leaving the hall and walking through the dark corridors until he reached his own quarters in the opposite wing. Far from her, as planned. But when he lay in his massive bed and tried to sleep, all he could see were those honey eyes, so similar to his own that it was almost unsettling, looking at him with a mixture of hurt and strength that shouldn't be possible to exist simultaneously. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She hadn't shown weakness. She had just faced him with a courage he hadn't expected. And somehow, that made everything even worse. Because it would be so much easier to be cruel to a weak woman. But Amira al-Zahra wasn't weak, and that complicated absolutely everything. Zayd closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep refused to come. 6 days still ahead. 6 days to make her give up. 6 days of being a monster. And he was already starting to hate himself for it. Day 2. Monday. Amira woke with the sun rising beyond the dunes, painting the sky in impossible shades of orange, pink, and gold. A sight that would have been breathtaking had she been in any mood to appreciate beauty. But she wasn't. She had slept poorly, her rest interrupted by vague nightmares that vanished the moment she opened her eyes but left a lingering sensation of unease clinging to her skin like oil. She woke with a headache throbbing in her temples and eyes swollen from the tears shed the night before. Professional. Soraya entered at exactly 7 in the morning with a breakfast tray and news. His Highness Prince Zayd has requested to inform you that you have an engagement at 10 in the morning to go riding together. It is part of the cohabitation protocol. Amira drank her tea in silence, processing the information. So, he deigned to include her in an activity. What unexpected kindness. By 10 o'clock, she was at the stables, a smaller structure beside the main palace where magnificent Arabian horses rested in spacious stalls, dressed in appropriate riding attire Soraya had provided. Lightweight trousers, a long tunic covering her from shoulders to ankles, and her veil secured tightly to withstand the wind. And she waited. 10 o'clock turned into 10:30. 10:30 turned into 11. 11 turned into noon. Zayd did not appear. Amira remained seated on a wooden bench inside the stable, a book she had brought from her quarters open in her lap. Pre-Islamic poetry in classical Arabic. 1,500-year-old verses about love, loss, and a ruthless desert that killed the weak and tested the strong. She read. She waited. She read more. She waited more. The stable hands tending to the animals walked past and averted their gaze, too embarrassed to look her in the eye. Everyone knew. Everyone saw. Yet another public, deliberate humiliation. When Zayd finally appeared at 2 in the afternoon, 4 full hours late, Amira was still there. The book was now closed on her lap, her hands folded over the worn leather cover, her posture perfectly erect even after hours on that uncomfortable bench. He stopped at the stable entrance when he saw her, his honey eyes meeting hers with an expression that might have been surprise if he were capable of showing genuine emotion. "You're still here?" The words came out laden with obvious contempt he didn't even try to hide. Amira closed the book calmly before responding, taking deliberate time to organize her thoughts and ensure her voice would remain steady. "Protocol dictates we must ride together. I was waiting." Zayd walked toward her with the lazy, arrogant strides of a man who knows he holds all the power, stopping too close, invading her personal space in a way that made her heart race for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. He smelled of sun and sand and something masculine and musky that made her head spin slightly. "Are you really going to be such an obedient, pathetic wife?" he asked, a cold, cruel laugh escaping his full lips. "Waiting hours for a man who clearly doesn't care?" It was the word pathetic that ignited something in her chest. Anger. Genuine, hot anger burning through the resignation and the pain and all the other emotions she had been forcing down since she arrived. Amira stood up slowly, keeping her eyes locked on his without blinking, without looking away, without showing the intimidation he clearly hoped to cause. "I am not pathetic. I am patient. There is a difference." Something flickered across his face. Surprise again, or perhaps reluctant respect. But it vanished too quickly to be sure. Zayd laughed, humorless. "We aren't riding. I changed my mind. I have work." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him mid-motion. "Of course." Her tone was so calm it took a second for him to process the subtle sarcasm hidden beneath the polite surface. Zayd turned back slowly, his amber eyes narrowing dangerously. "What did you say?" Amira smiled, a small, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I said I understand perfectly, Your Highness. After all, only your time is valuable." The silence that followed was charged with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Are you insulting me?" His voice came out low and dangerous, triggering every survival instinct in her body to retreat, to apologize, to lower her head and accept the inferior position. But Amira was tired. Tired of being polite while treated like garbage. Tired of maintaining dignity while being repeatedly humiliated. Tired of everything. "No, Your Highness. I am merely observing that my time apparently does not matter. I am just a decorative accessory in this political transaction after all." She walked past him with her head held high, leaving the book forgotten on the bench, leaving Zayd standing in the stable processing the fact that she had just insulted him. Politely. But definitely an insult. And he didn't know if he felt anger or something dangerously close to admiration for this woman who refused to break, no matter how cruel he was. The second night's dinner was a silent war, even more intense than the first. Zayd took 3 phone calls during the meal, speaking about business in a loud voice and completely ignoring Amira sitting across from him as if she were a piece of furniture, not a person. She didn't complain. She simply ate slowly, looking out the window at the desert illuminated by the full moon, which transformed the dunes into ethereal, silver waves. When Zayd finally ended the third call, Amira commented casually without looking at him. "It must be exhausting." Zayd frowned, reaching for his wine glass. "What?" Amira finally turned her face toward him, and those honey eyes, so like his own, but carrying a completely different emotional intensity, studied him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Working so hard to make me hate you. It must be tiring to maintain all this hostility when it would be easier to just be honest." The words hit like a punch to the gut because she was right, and they both knew it. Zayd set the glass down on the table with a force that made the red liquid splash against the rim. "I am being honest. I do not want this marriage." Amira nodded calmly, as if he had said something completely banal and expected. "I know. You made that extremely clear. But the question is, why do you need me to cancel instead of having the courage to cancel it yourself?" The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Because she was right. Absolutely and devastatingly right. Zayd was being a coward, making her endure horrible treatment instead of having the guts to openly defy his father. Instead of facing the consequences of his own choices, and hearing it said aloud by her with that infuriating calm that never cracked, made something dangerous happen in his chest. Anger mixed with shame, mixed with something else he didn't want to name. "You know nothing about me," he said, his voice hoarse with barely controlled emotion. Amira stood, placing her napkin beside her plate with measured, graceful movements. "I know enough, Your Highness. I know you are a 32-year-old man so desperate for freedom that he needs to destroy an innocent woman to get it. And that tells me everything I need to know about your character." She left without waiting for a response, leaving Zayd alone in the massive hall with her words echoing in his mind like an accusation he couldn't refute, because they were true. And the truth hurt more than any lie ever could. Day 3, Tuesday. Zayd woke determined to be even worse. She wanted honesty. He would give her brutal honesty. She wanted to see his true character. He would show her the ugliest pieces of himself until she couldn't stand it anymore and fled. Breakfast was the first opportunity. When Amira appeared, wearing a stunning traditional dress in shades of deep blue that enhanced her honey eyes in a way almost impossible to ignore, Zayd didn't even lift his gaze from the newspaper he was pretending to read. "You don't need to dress up for me. I don't care about your appearance." Amira poured her tea calmly, her face perfectly neutral. "I do not dress for you. I dress for myself. Because having self-respect does not depend on whether you notice me or not." Zayd gripped the newspaper with unnecessary force. "You are infuriating." For the first time, Amira laughed. A genuine, surprisingly beautiful sound that did something strange to his stomach. "Did you expect a submissive wife who cries when you are cruel? I apologize for disappointing you, Your Highness. I have had 27 years of training to endure men who mistake rudeness for power." Zayd threw the newspaper onto the table and finally looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since she had arrived. And it was a mistake. Because looking now, with the morning light pouring through the windows and illuminating her face in a soft golden glow, Zayd realized for the first time just how, not just pretty, but beautiful Amira al-Zahra was. Devastatingly beautiful in a way that stole his breath and made his heart beat faster. Her honey eyes shone with a sharp intelligence he hadn't expected. Her full lips curved in a half-smile that held something defiant and seductive all at once. Her black hair fell in perfect waves over delicate shoulders. Her slender body, with its subtle curves, was covered by the dress, yet somehow managed to be disturbingly attractive. And that calm, that infuriating serenity that never cracked, no matter how cruel he was. It made Zayd want to do things he shouldn't want to do. It made him want to mess up that calm until he saw a genuine reaction. It made him want to kiss that mouth until she stopped speaking such sharp words and started moaning his name. He pushed the thoughts down with brutal force. "Why did you accept this marriage?" he asked suddenly, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. Amira studied him for a long moment before answering. "For the same reason as you. Duty, family, tradition. The same chains that suffocate you bind me as well, Your Highness." The raw honesty in her voice did something dangerous to his chest. Because she understood. She truly understood the prison he lived in, because she lived in the same one. And that was more dangerous than any physical attraction could ever be. In the afternoon, they had a wedding planning session with organizers who had come from the main palace specifically for the task. Zayd deliberately disagreed with every single one of Amira's suggestions. She wanted white flowers. He demanded red. She suggested traditional music. He ordered a modern orchestra. She chose a classic menu. He changed everything. It was childish, and he knew it. But the goal was to provoke a reaction. Any reaction that would break that infuriating calm. Amira merely noted every change with a neutral expression until the organizers left, looking thoroughly embarrassed. Then, she turned to Zayd. "Are you finished marking your territory?" Zayd leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." Amira smiled, a smile as sharp as a blade. "You are acting like a 5-year-old who didn't get the toy he wanted. I understand. You don't want to marry me. You have made that extremely clear over the last 72 hours. But turning our ceremony into a battlefield is pathetic, not powerful." The word pathetic coming from that soft mouth made Zayd feel something hot and dangerous rise up his spine. He stood slowly, walking toward her with measured, predatory steps, invading her personal space until they were separated by mere inches, close enough to smell the jasmine perfume she wore. close enough to see the gold flecks in her honey eyes, close enough to realize she wasn't breathing normally. "Watch what you say, princess." His voice came out low and dangerous, laden with something that wasn't exactly a threat, but wasn't exactly safe either. Amira lifted her chin, eyes fixed on his without fear. "Or what? You'll be ruder? Crueler? Please, Your Highness. I survived a royal court full of vipers since I was 5. You will have to do much better than that." They stood there, suspended in time, so close Zayd could feel the heat of her body, could see the pulse fluttering in her delicate neck, could perceive that despite her bravado, she was affected by the proximity just as much as he was. And God, he wanted her. He wanted to push her against the wall and show her exactly what she did to him. He wanted to kiss that mouth until she ran out of sharp words. He wanted to rip that blue dress off and discover if the rest of her body was as beautiful as the parts he could see. But he couldn't. He shouldn't. Because that would destroy the entire plan. Zayd pulled back abruptly, putting a safe distance between them, ignoring the confused look in her eyes as he walked away without saying a word. And for the first time since starting this cruel game, Zayd began to wonder who was really winning. The third night's dinner was less hostile than the previous ones, but more tense in a strange, charged way. They sat closer, not at opposite ends, but at adjacent corners of the table. And conversation flowed with difficulty, but it flowed. Zayd caught himself observing every detail. How she folded her hands in her lap when she was thinking. How she tilted her head slightly to the left when listening. How she bit her lower lip when hiding a smile. How her honey eyes sparkled when she spoke about poetry or literature or any subject that clearly passionate her. And he realized with growing horror that he was starting to like her sharp intelligence, like the way she refused to be a victim, like the strength hidden beneath all that serenity. When Amira mentioned an old dream of traveling to famous libraries around the world, "I've always wanted to see the Bibliotheca Alexandrina restored, the British Library, the Library of Congress," Zayd heard himself saying, "I would take you to all of them." Amira froze, her eyes widening in genuine shock. "What?" Zayd shook his head quickly, retreating behind his cold mask. "Nothing. Forget it. Too much wine." But it wasn't the wine. It was the truth escaping before he could catch it. And they both knew it. After dinner, when they should have retired to separate quarters, they stayed on the terrace looking at the impossible stars shining in the desert sky. The silence wasn't hostile. It was comfortable. Almost. "I don't want you to go," Zayd confessed without looking at her, his hands gripping the marble balustrade. "I don't want the 7 days to end." Amira took a deep breath, the sound trembling slightly. "Because you discovered I'm not terrible." Zayd finally looked, really looked, in a way that left all his vulnerability raw and exposed. "Because I discovered you are extraordinary, and I am an idiot for taking 3 days to see it." The air between them was charged with something electric and dangerous. "Zayd, don't do this," Amira whispered, using his name for the first time without a title. "Don't give me hope if it isn't real." Zayd took a step closer, his hands trembling with the urge to touch, but lacking the courage just yet. "It is so real it terrifies me." They stood there under the stars, separated by inches and miles at the same time, both fighting against something that was growing too fast to control. And when they finally parted to sleep in opposite rooms, they both knew something fundamental had shifted. The game was becoming real, and neither of them knew how to stop it anymore. Day 4, Wednesday. Zayd woke with a strange sensation in his chest, a hot, urgent tightening he couldn't name, but one that made his heart race just at the thought of seeing Amira again. 3 days, and he was already completely screwed. The plan had been to make her give up. But what was happening was the complete opposite. He was falling in love. The words echoed in his mind with the weight of a devastating revelation. Falling in love. With a woman he had spent 3 days trying to emotionally destroy. With a woman who refused to break, no matter how cruel he was. with a woman who saw him through all his masks and still didn't run. Zayd dressed quickly and went to find her, locating her in the palace's massive library, a two-story room with shelves reaching from the floor to the soaring ceiling, filled with books in Arabic, Persian, and other ancient tongues. Amira was standing atop a tall, rolling ladder, searching for something among the volumes, completely absorbed. He watched her for a long minute before asking, "What are you looking for?" Amira nearly fell from fright, gripping the shelf tight. "Pre-Islamic poetry. I know there is a first edition here somewhere." Zayd frowned, walking closer. "You read pre-Islamic poetry?" Amira climbed down the ladder with an old, delicate book in her hands, her eyes shining with a genuine enthusiasm that transformed her entire face. "It is beautiful. The way they describe the desert, love, loss. It is so honest, so raw, so real." And then she recited from memory in perfect classical Arabic, her soft voice transforming 1,500-year-old words into music that made something squeeze painfully in his chest. Zayd stood there, listening to this woman recite ancient poetry with true passion, and knew with absolute certainty that he was completely and irrevocably lost. "You are full of surprises," he said before he could think, his voice hoarse with emotion. Amira blinked, surprised. "What?" Zayd shook his head, taking a step back because the proximity was becoming dangerous. "Nothing. Forget it." But Amira didn't forget. She watched him with those honey eyes that saw too much, and a small smile curved her lips. "You are starting to like me." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Zayd didn't deny it because the lie would have been too obvious. Wednesday's lunch was less tense. Zayd asked real questions, and Amira answered with an honesty he hadn't expected. "Why did you accept the life of a submissive princess?" he asked as they ate. "You clearly have a brain. You could have done anything." Amira drank her water slowly before answering. "And you? Why did you accept the life of a crown prince? You clearly hate protocol and gilded cages. You could have run away." Zayd laughed, humorless. "Duty, family, tradition." Amira smiled sadly. "Exactly. The same chains." They sat in silence for a moment, and for the first time, it wasn't a hostile silence. It was a silence of recognition. Two people equally trapped, looking at one another through the bars. "You aren't what I expected," Zayd admitted quietly. Amira tilted her head. "Did you expect an empty, obedient doll?" Zayd nodded. Amira smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "And you are not the unfeeling monster you try to appear to be. You are just a scared man fighting against a cage he didn't ask for." The way she saw right through him, the way she understood without judgment, made Zayd feel something dangerous and warm spreading through his entire chest. In the afternoon, Zayd found her in the library again, this time reading on a sofa near the window, the golden sunlight painting her face in a way that took his breath away. He sat on the opposite sofa without asking permission. Amira looked up from her book, surprised. "Your Highness?" "Zayd," he corrected. "Just Zayd when we are alone." Something softened in her eyes. Zayd. The name sounding in that soft voice did things to his stomach that it shouldn't. They talked for hours. About everything, about nothing, about lonely childhoods and heavy responsibilities and dreams buried under layers of expectation. And somewhere between sunset and the moon rising, Zayd realized he didn't want her to leave anymore. He didn't want this to end. He wanted to know her more. He wanted to hear more of that genuine laughter. He wanted to see more of that fire hidden beneath the calm. He wanted her. The fourth night's dinner was different from all the previous meals. They sat side by side instead of apart. Conversation flowed naturally. Smiles were frequent. And when their hands touched accidentally while reaching for the same water pitcher, the electricity that passed between them was undeniable. Zayd didn't pull his hand away immediately. Neither did Amira. They stayed there, fingers touching lightly, both breathing faster, both aware that a line was being crossed. "Amira," Zayd began, but didn't know how to finish. Amira turned her hand and interlaced her fingers with his. A small movement, but absolutely devastating in significance. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." And in that moment, under the candlelight and the stars visible through the windows, with hands clasped and hearts beating in sync, they both knew the game was over. Not because someone had won or lost, but because they were both falling, fast, inevitably, terrifyingly. And there was no turning back. Day 5, Thursday. Zayd woke up knowing he was completely screwed. 3 days left until the wedding. And instead of being closer to making Amira give up, he was obsessed with keeping her. The plan had blown up spectacularly in his face. And the most terrifying part? He didn't care. At breakfast, Zayd suggested something impulsive. "Come ride with me, for real this time." Amira studied him with justified suspicion. "Why?" Zayd shrugged, trying to look casual and failing miserably. "Because you waited 4 hours in the stable the other day. You deserve to actually see the desert." Something softened in her eyes. Fragile hope mixed with caution. "All right." They rode side by side across the dunes, the powerful Arabian horses moving with natural grace over the sand, the silence now comfortable instead of tense. Amira rode as she had been trained since childhood. Perfect posture, absolute control. But when they reached the top of a giant dune with a 360-degree view of golden sand, she stopped her horse and sighed, a sound of pure pleasure. "It is beautiful. So beautiful it hurts." Zayd looked at her instead of the desert and thought exactly the same thing. They dismounted at the crest of the dune and stood there, side by side, gazing at the infinite horizon. Without thinking, Zayd reached for her hand. Amira didn't pull away. She simply interlaced her fingers with his and squeezed lightly. And that simple gesture, meant more than any words ever could. In the afternoon, a rare desert rain fell in a sudden violent storm. They were far from the palace when it began, forcing them to race for shelter in the ancient ruins of an abandoned fort, both soaking wet and laughing at the absurdity of getting caught in a downpour in the middle of nowhere. The adrenaline and forced proximity created something electric in the air. Amira removed her wet veil, and for the first time, Zayd saw her hair completely down, black waves streaming water down her back, dripping onto delicate shoulders exposed by the soaked tunic clinging to her body, revealing curves he had been trying not to notice. She was beautiful in a way that stole his breath and made the blood boil in his veins. "You're staring," Amira said without turning, her voice thick with something that wasn't exactly a complaint. Zayd didn't deny it. "You are beautiful." Amira turned slowly, her honey eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "You spent 4 days trying to make me feel ugly, and now you say this?" Zayd took a step closer, water running from his hair and dripping onto the ancient stone floor. "I never said you were ugly. I said I didn't care about your appearance." Another step. "I lied. Closer. I care. Too much." The sexual tension between them was so thick it could be carved. "Zayd!" Amira whispered his name, and it was like an electric shock running down his entire spine. Zayd stopped inches from her, close enough to feel her body heat despite their wet clothes, close enough to see every dark lash framing those impossible eyes. "No, this complicates everything." Amira smiled sadly. "Everything is already complicated." And then she did something that completely destroyed whatever defenses he was still trying to maintain. She reached for his face with a trembling hand, delicate fingers tracing the line of his jaw, moving up his cheek, brushing wet hair from his forehead. The touch was soft and hesitant and absolutely devastating. Zayd closed his eyes, leaning into her hand like a man dying of thirst in the desert finally finding water. "Amira, if you touch me like that, I'm going to lose control," he admitted, his voice rough. "Then lose it," she whispered back. And Zayd was lost. He spun her around quickly, pressing her against the cold stone wall, both hands on either side of her head, caging her without actually touching. Amira was breathing fast, eyes wide, but without fear. aroused. He could see it. He could feel it. Last chance to back away, Zayd warned, his voice low and dangerous. I don't want to back away. And then he kissed her. Finally. Inevitably. Desperately. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was a collision of repressed needs exploding all at once in a kiss that was more battle than affection. His hands finally touched her, gripping her waist, pulling her against his body with a force that should have hurt, but only made her moan against his mouth. Her hands buried themselves in his hair, pulling, demanding more. Tongues met in a desperate dance. Teeth grazed lips. Bodies pressed together, eliminating any space between them. It was urgent and hungry, years of loneliness dissolving in liquid heat and raw need. When they finally broke apart for air, both breathing heavily, Zayd rested his forehead against hers, eyes still closed. This changes everything, he whispered. I know. I don't want you to go anymore. I know. I am falling in love with you. The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and honest and absolutely terrifying. Amira opened her eyes, those honey eyes that saw him through every mask, and smiled. I am falling in love with you too, idiot. And she kissed him again, softer this time, slower, but no less devastating. They returned to the palace hours later when the rain finally stopped, riding side by side in a silence heavy with meaning. Everything had changed. There was no more game. There was no more cruel plan. There were just two people who had fallen, despite every effort not to. The fifth night's dinner was different, intimate. They sat together instead of apart. They spoke softly about everything and nothing. They laughed at private jokes only they understood. And when it was time to separate for sleep, they stood there in the corridor between their rooms, neither wanting to take the first step to leave. Amira, I need to tell you something, Zayd said, courage finally arriving. What is it? And then, he told her everything. The cruel plan. The intention to make her give up. Every deliberate act of cruelty. Everything. Amira listened in silence, her face too neutral, always a sign of emotion being controlled by sheer force of will. When he finished, the silence was deafening. So you spent 4 days trying to destroy me emotionally because you wanted your freedom. It wasn't a question. It was a painful realization. Yes, Zayd admitted miserably. But then you stayed. You stayed and showed me you are stronger, smarter, more extraordinary than anyone I have ever met. And now I am in love with you, and I have no idea what to do, because I ruined everything before it even began. Tears slipped down Amira's face. The first time he had seen her cry openly. You hurt me so much, she whispered, her voice cracking. You made me feel small. You treated me like an object. You tore me apart. Zayd took a step forward, but she raised a hand, stopping him. But I fell in love with you too, idiot. Zayd froze. What? Amira laughed through her tears. I fell in love with the man beneath all that cruelty. The man who quoted poetry with me. The man who took me to see the desert. The man who looks at me as if I am more than a decorative princess. She wiped the tears away angrily. But I cannot trust that yet. Because you spent 4 days proving you are capable of tremendous cruelty when you want something. How do I know that tomorrow you won't wake up and decide freedom is more important again? It was a fair and devastating question. Zayd had no good answer. You can't know. You can only trust. Amira shook her head. Trust is built. You destroyed the foundation before we even tried. She turned toward her own quarters. I will cancel the wedding. You won. You have your freedom. Panic exploded in Zayd's chest. No, Amira, wait! But she had already entered her room and closed the door behind her with a finality that sounded like a death sentence. And Zayd stood in the hallway, processing that he had achieved exactly what he wanted 4 days ago. She was going to cancel. He would be free. And all he felt was a devastating emptiness, because freedom without her was worth absolutely nothing. Day 6, Friday. Zayd didn't sleep. He spent the entire night awake, processing, planning, despairing. He had to fix this. He had to. He couldn't lose her because he had been an idiot, too proud to admit what he wanted from the start. Early in the morning, he knocked on her door. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. Amira, please, let me explain. Silence. Zayd rested his forehead against the cold wood, defeat weighing heavy on his shoulders. I am sorry. I am more sorry than I can express. I was cruel and cowardly, and you deserved so much better. But please, give me a chance to show you who I really am. No masks, no games, just me. The door opened. Amira stood there, eyes red from weeping all night, dressed in simple traveling clothes. I have already messaged my father. I am canceling. No. Zayd, give me today. One day. Let me show you something. And if afterward you still want to leave, I won't stop you. I promise. Amira should have refused. She should have gotten into the car and never looked back. But something in his eyes, genuine desperation and raw vulnerability, made her hesitate. One day, and then I go. Zayd took her riding for 3 hours through the desert until they reached a hidden place she had never seen, an impossible oasis amidst the dunes, surrounded by palms, with crystal clear water shimmering under the sun. It was breathtakingly beautiful. I come here when I need to think, Zayd said quietly. No one else knows about this place. It has been my refuge since I was a child. Amira understood what he was doing, showing vulnerability, sharing something sacred. Why did you bring me here? Zayd helped her dismount, his hands lingering on her waist for a second too long. Because I need you to understand. I spent 32 years suffocating. And when they said I had to marry you, it was the final straw. I broke. I reacted with cruelty, because I was desperate for control. He took her hands. But you didn't deserve to pay for my prison. And I am sorry. I am sorrier than words can say. Amira felt tears burn again. Being sorry doesn't change what happened. I know. But let me show you who I truly am. Let me try. They spent the entire day there, talking properly for the first time without games or masks. Zayd spoke of his suffocating childhood, of learning to use cruelty as armor, of the fear of never being free. Amira spoke of growing up invisible, of developing a silent strength, of accepting her cage because she saw no way out. And somewhere between the confessions and the sunset painting the desert in impossible golds and oranges, they kissed. Soft at first, then urgent, desperate. Years of loneliness dissolving in the heat of each other's touch. When they pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Amira whispered, I am still afraid. Afraid you will change your mind. Afraid I will wake up and you will have decided you hate me again. Zayd rested his forehead against hers. I never hated you. Not for a second. I was just so afraid of losing my freedom that I didn't see that you would be my freedom. Amira closed her eyes. How do we make this work? Zayd smiled for the first time in days. We break the rules together. Marry me, but not as a submissive wife. Marry me as a partner. We change the traditions. We create our own life. Amira opened her eyes, and there was hope there, fragile but real. Do you really think we can? Zayd kissed her again, long and deep and full of promises. I think if we can survive 5 days of trying to destroy each other, we can survive anything. They returned to the palace at nightfall. The families were in a panic, thinking something had happened. When they arrived holding hands, everyone stopped in shock. Amira approached Sultan Al-Marwan, Zayd's father, and spoke with a clear voice. I would like to reconsider the cancellation, if your majesty will still permit it. The old sultan studied her, then Zayd, and smiled. The marriage may still proceed if both agree. Amira looked at Zayd. Zayd squeezed her hand. I agree, if she agrees. Amira smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face. I agree. Day 7. Saturday. The wedding day arrived, unlike any previous royal ceremony. Amira insisted on changes that broke centuries of tradition. They would write their own vows. They would walk to the altar together. They would promise partnership instead of obedience. And Zayd supported every change because he finally understood that freedom isn't being alone. It is being with someone who sets you free. When the time came for the vows, Zayd promised, "I promise never to use cruelty as a weapon again. I promise to see you every day as the extraordinary person you are. I promise to break every tradition that imprisons us. And I promise to love you not despite your strength, but because of it." Amira promised, "I promise never to accept being invisible again. I promise to fight for us even when it is hard. I promise to remind you of who you are when you forget. And I promise to love you not despite your flaws, but to help you grow through them." When they kissed as husband and wife officially, the entire court applauded. But Zayd could only hear his heart beating in sync with hers. "I almost lost you," he whispered against her lips. Amira smiled. "But you fought for me, and that made all the difference." Years later, when they told the story to their children, 3 boys with honey eyes and a girl with her mother's fire, they didn't lie about the 6 days. They told them how Zayd tried to sabotage it, how Amira refused to give up, how they almost lost each other to pride and fear. But in the end, Amira always finished, "We discovered that true love isn't finding a perfect person. It is finding a person willing to fight for imperfection alongside you." And Zayd always added, "And sometimes, you only need 7 days to discover that the prison you feared most was exactly the freedom you always needed." True love isn't about finding the perfect person. It's finding someone willing to fight for imperfection by your side. That is what Zayd and Amira discovered in just 7 days of cohabitation, that swung between emotional warfare and complete surrender. And now, the moment our most loyal friends have been waiting for, the comment of the day. I'm running low on ideas today. Let's go with rain in the desert. I know, a bit plain. But there are days and there are days, right? In our protagonist's case, there were 7. But if you have a better idea for a keyword, drop it in the comments and I'll pin it. If this story moved you, if you rooted for them even when it seemed impossible, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because you deserve more stories that make your heart race like this. And since you survived this journey to the very end, do you think you can handle finding out what happens when a powerful sheikh unknowingly marries his fiancée's identical twin sister? One lied to save her sister, the other married a stranger to save his kingdom. But what happens when the deception is revealed after the wedding night? If you are ready for a scandal that will shake the desert sands, click on the video on your screen right now. You won't believe how this deception ends. I'll see you there.